Today we're into chapter 21, section number 2, which is going to talk about France, and in particular, King Louis XIV, one of the most famous rulers of France in all of history, and one of the most famous rulers in the history of the world as well. To introduce this, we'll talk about first King Henry II and his wife, Catherine de Medici. Henry II of France, this series of information actually starts with his death, which happened in 1559. This left a pretty big problem in France because most of his sons were very young and all three were known to be worthless rulers. One of the things about this is that a lot of times these children were pampered pretty well. They tried to teach them the ways of ruling and getting them ready, but because they lived such a pampered lifestyle in the palaces and the courts of the king, it was really hard to kind of toughen them up and get them into a position where they could take control. Therefore, their mother, who well-versed from the Medici family, was the real ruler. And she was the mastermind behind a major sad event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, in which French Catholics killed many Huguenot Protestants in 1572. In France, they called the Protestants Huguenots. This was after she had married her daughter off to a Huguenot Protestant named Henry of Navarre. So it's kind of an odd situation, but there's always been a lot of religious strife in France and in some of the other Western European countries, especially when it comes to Catholics and Protestants, or Catholics and Muslims, or Catholics and Jewish practitioners. So this is something that's not all too uncommon during this area, and during this time period. Roman numeral number 2 is going to talk about some more of those religious wars and power struggles, which would include the son of who Catherine married her daughter off to. That's Henry of Navarre. Now, he took over the throne when Catherine and her last son had died in 1589. When he becomes the king, he becomes known as Henry IV. He's the fourth significant person named Henry to rule France. He's of the family known as the Bourbon family, and he was the first ruler of the Bourbon dynasty in France, which would eventually also be what Louis XIV was from. Because of the Catholic opposition to the Huguenot king, especially in Paris, Henry actually converted to Catholicism. So because he's seeing a lot of pressure from Catholics, he converts from Protestantism to Catholicism to try and alleviate some of those issues. In 1598, he did, though, issue what's called the Edict of Nantes. It was basically a document that declared religious tolerance or religious toleration in France. It meant that you could practice freely whatever faith you wanted to. And about 10 years later, in 1610, a religious fanatic leaped into the royal carriage and actually stabbed Henry to death. This was after 19 other assassination attempts at Henry's life. So this is going through quite a tumultuous time period in French history. Eventually, Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, who was his minister of religion, would then come to rule France. Now, Louis XIII was Henry's son. He was generally known to be a weak king, but he had a powerful, what we call second-hand man, and that was Cardinal Richelieu, who was Louis's minister and eventually became the ruler of France behind the scenes. I'm going to show you here Cardinal Richelieu. So this is a painting of Cardinal Richelieu, and you don't generally see paintings like this showing a grandeur style of a religious leader. That was sort of seen as secularism. So this is one of the things that you have to understand, is that Cardinal Richelieu most likely is standing in this position to underscore his position as a ruler. So he's trying to take a kind of a back seat here. He's not trying to show everybody that he's the ruler. He doesn't want to show up the king. But in actuality, he's really the one making the decisions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here. Richelieu actually made 2 big moves to help secure power for Louis XIII and, of course, the Bourbon dynasty. One thing that he did is he passed regulations and restrictions on Protestant Huguenots. One of the big examples that I'll tell you here that he used is he did not allow Protestant cities and towns to have stone defense walls around them. The reason for this is that he felt like if they were to ever do anything against the Catholic Church, that this way they would be able to be invaded more feasibly. So that's just one example of restrictions passed against Protestants. There were many others, but I think that kind of gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. He also tried to take away power from French nobles by taxing them and also limiting the amount of land that they could take away from, of course, the power of the king. So there's always a struggle between the wealthy factions in these early kingdoms and, of course, the king and the king's court. Now, he did experience opposition and competition from the Habsburg rulers. The Habsburg rulers were the family of Spain, the family of Charles V, and then his brother Ferdinand, who then took over Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, which is modern-day Germany. They gave him a little bit of trouble. They wanted to, of course, limit the power of France because they wanted to keep themselves in power for the longest period of time. Now, during this time period in history, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, there was something called skepticism. Skepticism was a philosophy, a concept that nothing can ever be known for certain. So skeptics would really question churches. They would question the church's claim to have the correct set of doctrines and practices. There were two famous skeptics. One was named Montaigne, Michael de Montaigne, by the way. He developed the essay. So if you don't like writing essays in class, the 3-paragraph essay, the 5-paragraph essay where you have to have a thesis and then defend it with your own thoughts and opinions, you can definitely blame Montaigne for that. And he believed that humans could really never have an absolute knowledge of what is true. And that's how the essay came into play, because the essay is an attempt to prove something. So that's where that comes into play there. René Descartes was also a philosopher that helped use skepticism to create the scientific method. His famous quote is, "I think, therefore I am." And he's trying to say, okay, since I can think, I am in existence. So he actually was a skeptic, but he then used the scientific method and scientific methodology to argue against skeptics. Now, if you're a religious or a political ruler, you don't like Montaigne and you don't like Descartes questioning things that are going on. So they were threatened by the notion that humans could never truly know the truth, because the church is saying, hey, we know what's going on. Here is the truth. You need to follow this. And so skeptics were something that the church definitely did not like. Now we're getting it into Louis XIV, which is what this section is really all about. He was the most powerful king in French history. He was actually only 4 years old when he took the throne in 1643. This is when his father, Louis XIII, had died. While he was young, Cardinal Richelieu's successor, who was Cardinal Mazarin, actually was the one ruling. Because when you're 4 years old, you can't make decisions, guys, okay? During this time, nobles did not like Cardinal Mazarin, and they attempted actually to assassinate both him and Louis XIV to take power. Therefore, Louis would always remember this, and he would always try and strive to weaken the authority of the nobles. Louis took control of government actually at age 22 when Cardinal Mazarin had died. This was in 1661. One of his early moves was to weaken the power of nobles by excluding them from being on his advisory councils. So if they're not in the advisory council, they really don't have much of a say of what's going on in France. He replaces them with what are called intendants. Intendants are tax collectors, judges that would replace the nobles in these advisory roles. During Louis XIV's reign, there was a lot of economic growth for France. This was primarily due to his financial minister, who was Jean Baptiste Colbert. He was Louis XIV's minister of finance, it means economics, and he believed in the theory of mercantilism. He wanted France to develop a favorable balance of trade through what he deemed self-sufficiency. He wanted to produce items in France and then export those items to other countries. He also created colonies for the French in Canada, which provided wealth through the fur trade, which they traded with native peoples. And they also required taxes on imported goods. So if you want to increase your exports and you want to decrease your imports, one thing to do is tax imports there. Back in the mercantilist time. That doesn't always work today, but it can have an impact as well. One problem that took place, though, is when Jean Baptiste Colbert died, Louis canceled the Edict of Nantes, that religious tolerance. This actually hurt the economy because it led to the loss of many Huguenot artisans, Protestant artisans, and business people. So if you were a Protestant and you were having good business in France that was helping the economy overall, once the Edict of Nantes is canceled, you'd be less likely to stay in France because you were not permitted to worship freely. Next is going to be talking a little bit about King Louis XIV and some of the things that he did. He lived a luxurious lifestyle. Most of these kings did. He spent a fortune, actually, to surround himself with luxurious items. Each meal for him was a feast with all the fixings. He employed nearly 500 cooks, waiters, and other servants to satisfy just his needs. He was known to be historically, it's documented that he was rather portly. That means he was fairly large. He was short, but he ate a lot of food all the time, and he indulged on that. So that's one of the things that you want to think about with Louis XIV. You're not going to probably see that in any of his paintings, because he's going to want to look, of course, the ideal way in what he's going to commission painters to draw him as. But in real life, most historical documents that you read will say he was rather portly. He did always remember that the nobles tried to assassinate him, and so he controlled them in the best ways that he could. Every day, hundreds of nobles would come to Louis's palace, hoping for just a chance to help him get dressed. In fact, each day he would select 4 nobles to participate in getting him dressed. We're talking about pulling on his socks, putting on his coat, the whole outfit. These nobles would come and grovel at his feet and get him dressed. This is a way for him to flatter himself. This is a way for him to say, look, I'm here and the nobles are here. And he would take note of what nobles would come to flatter him and which of those did not. And those that didn't come really wouldn't get any assistance from him. Eventually, he had constructed the Palace of Versailles, which is about 11 miles south of Paris. Page 600 in your textbook shows a lot of pictures and explanations of that. I'm going to show you that here in just a moment. This is something about the Palace of Versailles here. This is kind of the architecture. You can still visit the Palace of Versailles today. It cost an estimated $2.5 billion in modern time period money, and it used 36,000 laborers and 6,000 horse to complete the project. So it was a grand endeavor here. And actually, the peace treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, was actually signed in this building. And here's kind of a layout of the overall structure of the Palace of Versailles. It's a pretty magnificent place, something to visit if you're ever in France. Okay, to end this off, Roman numeral 6 talks about Louis getting involved in disastrous wars. French power during Louis's reign was at its height. He had a very large army, advanced weaponry, and they were actually very well trained. There were some attempts to expand the French boundaries. In 1667, Louis actually invaded the Netherlands. France gained a small number of towns here, but nothing major. This attempt at an invasion actually led people around France to say, whoa, we need to watch out for France. And what happened is European powers formed an alliance against France. One of the leaders in this movement was William of Orange, who was a Dutch prince from the Netherlands. He eventually became the king of England in 1689 with what's called the Glorious Revolution. He and his wife, Mary, overthrew the king, and he joined into what's called the League of Augsburg. The League of Augsburg included all of these entities: Habsburg Austria, Sweden, Spain, very, very powerful in the 1500s, but sort of dwindling at this time. Many smaller European states, okay, the Dutch Netherlands, and England. This alliance, though, only equaled the power of France alone. So you can see how powerful France was, that it took all of these different entities to rival their power. One big picture event that took place that kind of brought all of this together was the War of Spanish Succession. It's kind of confusing to understand, but let me try to explain. The Spanish King Charles II left his throne to Louis XIV's grandson, who's named Philip of Anjou. So let's talk about that. The Spanish king doesn't have an heir. He wants to leave his throne to the French. That's kind of interesting. This brought France and Spain as one entity under the Bourbon dynasty, or would have brought France and Spain under one entity. In 1701, England, Austria, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, along with German and Italian city-states, joined forces in what once was the League of Augsburg to prevent the French and Spanish Union. They believed that this would be too powerful of an impact here for them to join forces. This was known as the War of Spanish Succession because it's about who was going to be the next king of Spain. It's basically a war between the unified force that I just mentioned and the combined forces of France and Spain. The war ended in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, and the winners were the opposite side. So Spain and France must remain separate entities. The big winner in all of this is England, because they took over strategic territories and new trade routes by limiting the combination of France and Spain. Then all of this sort of comes to a halt, and there's going to be a reset in France with the death of Louis in 1715. This is a drawing, a painting of Louis XIV. It does say that he lived from 1638 to 1715. He was only 5'5", so he's rather short. And it was known that one thing he would do is wear high-heeled shoes to make himself look a bit taller. Just to sort of drive home the point that I was mentioning earlier about the king's grand style and how much he would eat and being a portly fellow, this is from an observer who was once invited to join the king for a meal. He mentions that the king during this meal devoured 4 plates of soup, an entire pheasant, a partridge soaked in garlic sauce, 2 slices of ham, a salad, an entire plate of pastries, fruit, and hard-boiled eggs just in one sitting. Okay, so this is just one example of how these kings had such a pampered lifestyle. Thanks for listening.